The United States has frozen more than $458 million that former military head of state, General Sani Abacha, and his conspirators obtained through corruption and hid in bank accounts around the world.
The federal government has signed a fresh agreement with the United States for the repatriation of $23 million allegedly looted by the late former military head of state, General Sani Abacha.
When you hear the name Abacha, your mind probably wanders to the millions of dollars of Abacha loot. But for those who were around in the 90s, that name was associated with a lot more than just money. For one, it brought fear to every Nigerian, and you will understand why in a moment.
Consequently, the following decisions come into immediate effect. The interim national government is hereby dissolved. The national and state assemblies are also dissolved. The state executive councils are dissolved. The brigade commanders are to take over from the governors in their states until administrators are appointed. All local governments stand dissolved. The directors of personnel are to take over the administration of the local governments until administrators are appointed. The two political parties are hereby dissolved. This regime will be firm, humane, and decisive. We will not condone nor tolerate any act of indiscipline. Any attempt to test our will be decisively dealt with.
And he meant that. Abacha was going to be very decisive in dealing with any form of opposition, which gives a kind of glimpse into the type of leader Nigerians were getting. A man who would crush even the slightest opposition. It makes you wonder how such a man was allowed to take power in the first place. Some would argue that he took power in a coup, but history would lean towards Babangida as the one responsible for getting Abacha in a position to take power after the annulment of the June 12th elections, a decision that made Babangida quite unpopular at the time. Now, while most people focus on his annulment of the June 12th elections as the harbinger of Abacha's tyranny, I would say we'll look at what happened next, beginning with Babangida's exit from government and his controversial installation of a Harvard-trained industrialist to run what was described as an interim government.
I, Ernest Adegunle Oladende Sonekon, do solemnly swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So help me God.
However, Babangida made another controversial appointment. He appointed Abacha as the interim government's Minister of Defense. Looking at it, it seemed logical, as Abacha would only be watching over the interim government. But it was like telling a wolf to watch over your sheep, and that can only end one way. Barely 3 months into Shonekon's government, Abacha forced him to resign and took power for himself. That was the beginning of the end for Nigerians. Abacha took power on 17th November 1993, and his first speech projected a man confident in his ability to lead, and one that wouldn't take kindly to opposition. His first act of government dissolved practically every existing political structure, including political parties and the National Electoral Council. On the flip side, Abacha divided Nigeria into 6 geopolitical zones and promised a constitutional conference that would seek to establish a more inclusive constitution. This was one of the few initial appeals of his administration. He also lifted Babangida's ban on the media houses, but it didn't exactly translate to press freedom. Media houses still faced a form of censorship. In spite of all this, most people were happy with the removal of the interim government, which they believed was incapable of administering the affairs of the nation. If only they knew what was to come. Like Babangida, Abacha chose to run his government from Abuja due to the amount of political opposition he expected to face in Lagos. But unlike Babangida, Abacha didn't suffer a need to be liked. In fact, he didn't care if he was liked or not. He was only focused on implementing his own policies. With his power consolidated and his general acceptance as the head of state across the country, Abacha made sure to surround himself with loyalists in a bid to nullify any possibility of a coup attempt. One of such loyalists was his head of security, Mayor Al-Mustafa, who would be instrumental in Abacha's oppressive rule. While this was happening, the political class watched and waited for Abacha to make a move on the annulled June 12th elections. One man in particular hoped Abacha would uphold the elections and install him as president. That man was Chief MKO Abiola, the supposed winner of the June 12th elections. It probably explains why Abiola wasn't critical of the Abacha administration early on. In his words, Abacha's takeover was an act of God. He would later come to regret that statement. As time went on, it became clear that Abacha had no interest in upholding the June 12th elections. A group of politicians and intellectuals, in a bid to push for the revalidation of the elections, formed the National Democratic Coalition on May 15, 1994. This coalition included prominent Nigerians like Nobel Prize winner Wale Soyinka and Chief Anthony Enahoro. They would become a thorn in the flesh of Abacha's government. Their first big blow to Abacha's government came when they successfully advised the Southwest to boycott Abacha's National Constitutional Conference. This meant that whatever the outcome of the conference, the new constitution will always be seen as illegitimate, since it didn't include contributions from the Southwest. Another organization that strongly opposed Abacha's rule was the Campaign for Democracy, CD, led by Dr. Beko Ransom Kuti, who described the government as being most brutal. In the meantime, Nigeria was gradually approaching the one-year anniversary of the June 12th elections, and as you'd expect, Abiola made a statement. However, it wasn't what anyone would expect. On June 11th, Abiola declared himself president. The declaration came to be known as the Epetedo Proclamation.
In view of all this, I find the conclusion unfortunate but inescapable that the federal military government is guilty of bad faith, pure and simple. No one has accused me of any offense against any known electoral law or regulation. The people of this country went to polls on Saturday, June 12, 1993, and without let or hindrance chose me as their president. Didn't they?
It's not clear what Abiola's motivations were. Perhaps he was starting to realize that Abacha would never revalidate the June 12th elections. But one thing was sure, Abiola truly believed he was securing his mandate this way. And if his recent international trips a few days before the declaration was anything to go by, you could see that Abiola was looking to spark a reaction among Nigerians and the entire international community. He had hoped that his declaration would generate a huge reaction that may perhaps force Abacha's hand. In one aspect, Abiola was right. The Epetedo Proclamation did force Abacha's hand, but not in the way Abiola hoped. You see, Abacha, unlike Babangida, didn't care too much about swaying public opinion in his favor. So, in response to Abiola's declaration, he declared Abiola wanted. Abiola was arrested on June 23, 1994 by the Inspector General of Police accompanied by close to 200 police vehicles. It was Abacha's way of making a statement that he would go all out to crush any opposition. Maintaining his cheerful spirit, Abiola waved to thousands of his supporters as he got into a police vehicle. It would be his final public appearance. For the next 4 years, Abiola spent his days in solitary confinement, watched closely by 14 guards. Despite mounting international pressure and pleas, Abacha was resolute in making an example of him, leading to his death 4 years later. Ironically, it was the day he was due to be released. Abiola's prolonged incarceration would become a blueprint for dealing with anyone that dared to go against Abacha. In fact, a few months before Abiola's arrest, Abacha's government had adopted a similar style approach with the arrest of Ken Saro-Wiwa, a known activist for the Ogoni people. The Ogoni people were a community in the oil-rich Niger Delta area. However, despite having vast amounts of oil, the Ogoni people weren't exactly reaping their rewards. They received no special allocations from the federal government, despite having a high contribution to the nation's revenue. And the worst part? Years of drilling by oil companies had polluted their supply of drinking water. Essentially, the Ogoni people needed help, and Ken Saro-Wiwa was one of the activists that lent a voice to their struggles. But Abacha wasn't one to welcome criticism, as we would see in the way he ruled Nigeria. Now, you may be wondering how Nigerians reacted to news of Abiola's arrest at the time. Well, let's just say they weren't too happy with it. Abiola's arrest triggered a nationwide strike by Nigeria's oil workers' union, Nupeng and Penga's son. The strike crippled the Nigeria's economy and caused untold hardship to Nigerians, and it continued for over a month. Nigerians were facing the worst fuel crisis ever, and it only seemed to be getting worse each day. It was at this time that Nigerians began to embrace striking moving no matter the destination. However, Abacha's government didn't flinch. They were resolute in making an example of Abiola, not minding the mounting pressure from the people, though it was the people that suffered the most. Fuel scarcity meant outrageous fuel prices, which translated to a higher cost of living. Times were indeed hard, and it was only going to be a matter of time before the people snapped. And trust me, it didn't take too long.
Tensions in Nigeria grew from last year's presidential elections, which were annulled by the military after the People's Choice, Moshood Abiola, appeared to win. He's now in jail.
What began as a peaceful protest against the harsh situation of the country soon turned to a riot spanning most of the southwest that involved a state governor being held hostage and up to 100 protesters killed. To any external observer then, it may come as a surprise that the people's anger was directed towards the government rather than the oil workers' union that had basically shut down the economy. However, Nigerians had good reason to be dissatisfied with the Abacha regime. On the one hand, the oil workers' strike was a result of the government's arrest of Abiola. Now, add the natural distrust that Nigerians had started to have for military leaders, and you start to see why the rioters began to demand the release and installation of Abiola as the rightful president. This was as good as demanding Abacha's resignation as head of state. And if there was one thing Nigerians had learned about military leaders, it's that they weren't exactly keen on surrendering power. At first, Abacha tried offering Abiola a chance of freedom by granting him bail. But here's the catch. Abiola was to refrain from making speeches and embarking on actions that undermined the peace and security of Nigeria. It was basically a way of telling Abiola to move on from the June 12th elections. However, Abiola didn't take the option, and what followed was a total crackdown on all pro-democracy institutions and individuals. First, Abacha shuts down the Punch, Guardian, and Abiola's Concord newspapers, which had a known history of being pro-democracy. The Guardian, in particular, had been highly critical of Abacha since his rise to power. Next, he came for the unions, dissolving the executive boards of Nupeng, Pengasan, and the NLC. Even then, Abacha was just getting started. His next move was a set of arrests that targeted key figures that opposed his rule, starting with Chief Anthony Anahuru, General Alania Kindrinade, and Chief Cornelius Adebayo, who were prominent Nadeco officials. Along with the Nupeng General Secretary Frank Kokori, Abacha made sure to round up any opposition to his government, and those he couldn't arrest, he shut them up permanently. Perhaps one that stuck out was the attempt on Gani Fawemi's life by some unknown men, believed to be organized by Abacha government. In fact, the attack on Gani Fawemi was just one of many attacks against any form of opposition by Abacha. During this time, Nigerians lost all forms of free speech. You had to be careful what you said about the government if you really valued your freedom. If General Buhari's government had taught Nigerians the meaning of fear, Abacha had redefined it. Protesters were shot at, opposition leaders arrested and tortured, and many prominent Nigerians had their passports seized for being pro-democracy. It was a terrible time to be a Nigerian, but things were about to get even worse. On September 5th, 1994, Abacha issued 2 decrees that essentially put his government above the rule of law. Decree number 61 allowed for the detention of individuals for up to 3 months, without trial, and Decree number 62, which mandated people to seek approval from the government before organizing public gatherings or protests. It was Abacha's way of saying you were not allowed to protest, and if you did, then there was no telling what could happen to you. It essentially signaled Abacha's transition from a military ruler to a dictator. Naturally, this brought huge backlash from many prominent Nigerians, including the then Attorney General Olu Ngarua and Gani Fawemi. Seeing how he could just create any set of rules to suit his personal agenda, Abacha came back with 2 new decrees in November 1994. First, he suspended the right of the habeas corpus that legally required any arrested person to be presented before a judge. Next, he banned the hearing of any legal challenge against the indefinite detention of arrested persons. This meant that Abacha's government could arrest anyone on non-existing charges and detain that person indefinitely. With his civilian opposition out of the way, Abacha turned to the military. You see, while Abacha was a military ruler himself, he didn't particularly trust the military. And if his involvement in various coups had taught him anything, it's that someone was always looking to take power. So he did what most dictators would do. He arrested various top military officers that were known to be dissatisfied with his regime, including General Olusegun Obasanjo and General Shehu Yaradua. With all opposition successfully out of the way, Abacha could now focus on ruling the country as he saw fit. He had managed to restore peace across most of the country, and with oil prices soaring, things were only going to get better. That turned out to be impossible as Nigeria was about to be barraged with economic sanctions that would essentially cripple the economy. And it all started with the arrest of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni activists in May 1994. Saro-Wiwa was accused of orchestrating the murder of 4 rival Ogoni, and a special military tribunal had been set up to hear the case, with no chance of an appeal whatsoever. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a threat to the government due to his activism against oil drilling in Ogoni land, which directly interfered with government interests, so they were ready to do anything to shut him up. But how far would they go? Well, people were about to find out. On October 31st, 1995, Ken Saro-Wiwa and his 8 companions were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The 9 activists were hanged on the 10th of November, despite pleas for a stay of execution from the international community. The single decision to hang someone who was no more than an activist pushing for better conditions for his people was seen as very undemocratic. But the manner in which the decision to execute Ken Saro-Wiwa was taken is even more questionable. First, the police arrested Femi Falana, one of his lawyers, preventing him from appearing at the trial. Also, his case was prosecuted at a military tribunal, usually meant only for accused persons who are military personnel. The entire thing was a sham designed to achieve one thing: a death penalty for the Ogoni activists.
Ken Saro-Wiwa, writer, human rights activist, campaigner on behalf of his fellow tribesmen, hanged this morning in a Nigerian prison. His alleged crime, the murder of 4 men, charges he adamantly denied.
There's no possibility whatsoever that I or Mossad would ever have planned any such action.
He was an inspirational leader to members of Nigeria's Ogoni tribe, whose ancient tribal lands have the misfortune to contain Nigeria's most productive oil fields.
The next day, Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth of Nations, and that was the beginning of a series of sanctions that would hit the Nigerian economy hard. Arms embargoes were imposed on Nigeria by the European Union, South Africa, and the United States. However, these sanctions would eventually subside, and the Abacha regime would soon be back in business. For Abacha, the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa was business as usual, and was the beginning of a series of arrests that included journalists, democracy activists, and anyone who dared to criticize the Abacha-led government. It was also the start of bombings that soon became commonplace in Nigeria. Abacha also utilized assassins to eliminate people he thought were too dangerous to his regime. Take Alhaja Kudirat Abiola, for example. She was a prominent pro-democracy activist and one of the most active NADECO members, an organization that had continually been a thorn in Abacha's flesh. She was murdered in her car by 6 unknown assailants, which is, many believed, to be Abacha's doing. Her death came as a shock to many, particularly to her young son.
After my mom passed, I remember I was still in school. So that was the first time that it was 2:30. There were no drivers to pick us up. I was like wondering what's going on. The driver actually eventually came around 4 o'clock. So we were in school till 4. So I knew there was something wrong. And it wasn't even like a driver, it was a taxi with my stepmom. I think she was the 5th wife. She picked us up and she took us to the house. When we get into the house, we hear, you know, but I didn't make sense of it. I just thought it was just another party. The house is always loud. We're always having one party or another. Well, my normal move when we're having the parties, I'll get on my knees and just pick the money off the floor. Make a lot of money on doing that. So I was like, oh, it's just another party. But then I got into my room. I was just playing games in my room, and this was my room then. I was playing games, and me and my brother Hadi, and my auntie, my mom's younger sister came in, Auntie Dupe, and said, Mommy's passed, Mommy is dead. You know, I didn't make it. And I was like, what are you talking about? I just saw it this morning, you know, like whatever, you know, I discarded it. And then I started to concentrate on what they were saying outside. And then when I looked out the window and I saw the grave, like her coffin being pulled, and I was like, wow.
At this point, Abacha was viewed as nothing more than a brutal military dictator, with his iron-fisted government, utter lack of respect for the rule of law, and the various human rights abuses that had taken place under his watch. However, Abacha did have some huge achievements. He had managed to put Nigeria's economy back on an upward trajectory after Ernest Shonekon's disastrous interim government. All forms of government borrowing had been gradually eliminated, and with soaring oil prices, Nigeria was witnessing a second oil boom. Unfortunately though, this was just on paper, because to the common man, Abacha wasn't any better than his predecessors. These economic gains were hardly felt by the common man. Instead, they shared amongst a small inner circle of Abacha's loyalists. Millions of dollars made from oil sales were siphoned to foreign accounts, in what would be later known as the Abacha loot. Incidentally, these loots are yet to be recovered completely to this day. Abacha's achievements couldn't shift focus from the sheer scale of human rights abuses taking place under his regime. And no matter how the government cracked down on opposition, they could never fully stop the criticism. Abacha would gradually flag off a plan that would see Nigeria return to civilian rule by 1998, starting with the inauguration of the National Electoral Commission of Nigeria, NECON. The government would also start releasing prisoners that were considered less of a risk to the Abacha administration. The National Constitutional Conference recommended a power structure that involved a hybrid of both the presidential and parliamentary systems of government, with the president, vice president, and prime minister. It seemed like finally Abacha was ready to give Nigerians what they had always wanted, a democratically elected government. However, there was one small problem. While the government had allowed the formation of various political parties, these parties had been coerced into all nominating Abacha as their presidential flag bearer, making him the only presidential candidate. So no, this wasn't a transition to democracy. Rather, it was a switch from Abacha the military dictator to Abacha the civilian dictator, and naturally many pro-democracy groups kicked against it. Abacha had a lot to do if he was going to maintain control and usher in a swift transition to his pseudo-democracy. First, he had to silence those kicking against his democratic transition plans, starting with Professor Wole Soyinka, who regularly criticized his government on radio, Chief Olufalaye, and Chief Anthony Enahoro. He declared these prominent activists wanted for treason, leading to them fleeing the country. By July 1997, the stage was set for the democratic elections, and despite a low voter turnout for registration, elections were set to hold between April and August 1998. The low turnout was because Nigerians weren't particularly trusting in a democratic process initiated by Abacha. Realizing the difficult position they were in, and with many more years of Abacha's rule on the horizon, Nigerians found God in many ways under Abacha. Various new churches and ministries were established as people sought the face of God, fearing more years of a brutal dictatorship. In the end, God did work a miracle.
The key oil-producing country of Nigeria is in a state of flux. Its military leader, General Sani Abacha, has died of a heart attack. Abacha was 54. Top officials of the West African country convened an emergency meeting to sort out the question of succession. Who will run this country, long kept under Abacha's thumb?
Abacha's death was almost as momentous as Nigeria gaining independence. It meant that once again, Nigerians could resume their democratic struggles and finally move past years of brutal oppression. Sadly, Chief Mkio Abiola had died of a long-standing heart condition on July 7, 1998, a day before Abacha's death. With Abacha dead, there was a huge power vacuum, and the man chosen to fill it was General Abdulsalami Abubakar. He gradually geared Nigeria towards an acceptable democratic process that saw General Olusegun Obasanjo emerge as the first president of the Fourth Republic. Incidentally, General Olusegun Obasanjo was one of the many people Abacha had kept imprisoned during his time. Whatever the future held for Nigeria, General Olusegun Obasanjo's inauguration as the democratically elected president of Nigeria signaled something. Nigeria was back.